Before I get started on this section, I just wanted to get a sense of the audience. So how many of you, just give me a quick show of hands, come into direct contact with the peer review process or your peer review system? And actually, good. Okay, that's a quorum. The rest of you can check your email or whatever you need to do. So to just go back to my presentation earlier, I discussed fake peer reviewers and authorship fraud, and I just want to real quickly go through what we've done at Journals at WK, what we're educating editors to do to combat those two things on a very sort of micro level. So this isn't so much an industry initiative as much as it is just a best practices initiative for editorial offices. So fake peer reviewers, as you recall, the biggest loophole that was being exploited was an option in review systems that allowed authors to suggest reviewers. So the solution to this is to turn off the option. How much time do I have left, Don? That's it. So that's the obvious one. There is, I will mention too, I didn't touch on this earlier, but I have a little more time on this one. There is another option, it exists in Editorial Manager and the other ones as well, that you might want to look at if you're using it, which is allowing the system when somebody registers, whether it's an author or anybody can register into the system usually, there is an option that allows that person to immediately be given a reviewer role. Once again, it's one of these things that sounds like an incredibly bad idea, but the reason it was put in there was so that if you were an editor or you were a managing editor in charge of finding reviewers, it would present to you all of the options within your database, all the individuals, so that if you had an author who had submitted a paper on a particular topic, they would show up on a reviewer search, even if they had never been a reviewer before, and even if you had never specifically given them the role of a reviewer. It would allow you to increase the number of ad hoc reviewers. It's something to keep in mind because it can be exploited. If, for example, let's say you have an author who submits a paper, and they give that paper, if you use a classification scheme at your journal, they submit the paper, and they give it 5 very specific classifications, and then 5 minutes later, they register into the system, and they give themselves as an individual those 5 exact same classifications. When an editor goes in and says, okay, maybe the system finds reviewers for me, it will bring up that person as the top of the list because they have 5 exact matching classifications. So it's an exploitable part of the system as well that I didn't touch on earlier. Even if you close off that option, tomorrow, obviously you might still have people lingering in the system from previous submissions that are fake reviewers. And so I want to talk real quickly about identifying those fake reviewers, is what we've discovered. The first thing is we all know how difficult it is to find reviewers, and once we've found them, to get them to review things in a timely fashion. Fake reviewers are unbelievably efficient. They are incredibly enthusiastic about accepting review requests. They are incredibly efficient about turning around their reviews to a degree that you would never normally see. So it's sort of a red flag. If somebody is, if you send out a review request and somebody accepts that request within 30 minutes and then actually does the review within 2 hours, there's a pretty good chance they're too good to be true. You have not located the best reviewer ever. You have probably just located a fake reviewer. The other thing that we've noticed about fake reviewers is, I mean, they do complete the reviews. This is part of it. They don't produce reviews that are glowing. They don't have to. They only have to produce a review that will result in an accept. So what they tend to do is, and obviously these are not clinicians who are doing the reviews, so the reviews themselves tend to be vaguely positive with absolutely no clinical detail whatsoever. The thing is, you see these from normal reviewers. That they're just not very good reviewers. They don't provide a lot of detail. But fake reviewers almost always will use these phrases like, this is a well-constructed study and the conclusions are supported by the results. That's a great comment, but it could apply to any submission you've ever received. So that's the other thing, a pattern of non-specific reviews that don't provide a great deal of clinical detail. And the other thing I want to touch on as well is this, the use of Gmail and Yahoo and 126 and 123 accounts. There are plenty of people in the world who legitimately use those accounts for various reasons. There are institutions, especially in developing countries, where they don't get an email address as the result of being at an academic institution. So there may not be such a thing as a .edu address for them. There are also people who just simply like to keep their academic institutional work separate from all of the emails they get from journals. So they probably give out a Gmail address as an alternative. I think it's fair to say that not all people who use Gmail are fake, but all people who are fake most likely use Gmail, Yahoo, Hotmail, some of those things. So what we've done, for example, at a journal is we've said to people, look, that's great, you've got a Gmail account, you can use it, but not for your initial registration into the system. You have to use an institutional address when you initially register in, so we know that there's a correspondence that goes to that institutional address that provides them the username and password. Then after that, they're free to go in and change it to a Gmail address, but initially we need something. Journals also are starting to use ORCID a little more. I think it's terrific. It gives another hoop for people to jump through. One issue, though, is I will say ORCID itself is not completely fireproof. You can create fake ORCID accounts as well. I've done it. It's possible. I was testing it. Okay, so authorship fraud. This is a little more detailed. One of the problems with authorship fraud, especially in situations where you get an email that says, we'd like to add another author onto the paper, is it's very difficult to determine the criteria under which you would say no, right? So somebody says, yeah, we've revised our paper when we've added on Dr. Smith. It's tough to be able to say to somebody, well, no, we're not going to do that, or what are your grounds for not doing that? Obviously, there are resources that define what authorship means. ICMG has that great paper that says what an author is. Here are the roles that would be considered authorship. COPE has some great workflows on how to deal with authorship concerns when they come up. But how do you actually combat this at the editorial level? So there's a few things that we've implemented at WK Titles, one of which is authorship change forms. So that when an author says, when the corresponding author says, I'd like to remove this person, or more likely, I'd like to add a person, there is a form that they must submit that is signed by all of the parties involved. So the author who's being added or removed, all of the co-authors, the corresponding author, and it just makes sure that it's just one more hoop to jump through. It just makes sure that it's not just one rogue author making changes, that all of the authors understand that this person is being added or removed, and they agree with it. The second thing is that ICMJE form that tells people what an authorship role is to have the authors actually submit a statement with the submission where they make a declaration of what each person did, so they can say this person designed the study, this person performed the study. It makes it that much more difficult for them to then justify adding somebody on later. It's kind of hard to say for Vision 4 that this person developed the study. So once again, it's just something to be done, but for authors to do that make it more difficult to perform fraud later. The other one is a little more hardcore, and I've suggested this occasionally to people who have a real problem, is to simply decline to make them. And to say to the authors, we're not going to make those changes just based on your request. If you seriously have an authorship problem that you did not get resolved prior to the final version, talk to your ethics committee and have them submit a letter to us, and we will make the change in an erratum post-publication. That seems kind of harsh, but it seems to work in that you're not holding up the publication of a paper, you're forcing another party to actually adjudicate the situation, because one thing I tell editors, especially the developing nations editors I deal with at Medno Publications, is you do not want to be adjudicating authorship disputes. It's not something you want to be involved in, and at any opportunity you have to pass that off onto somebody else, do so, because you're just bringing yourself a headache and liability and all sorts of other problems. So those are the suggestions on how to deal with those two specific issues that we've been dealing with at WK and at Medno Publications.